I'm really excited to introduce this session and a wonderful panel that we've organized to reflect on John's really lovely and elegant talk this morning. The pre-lunch talk was just so beautiful and so timely. There's so many lessons there. And I do think, what was communicated, we are well positioned to have these conversations, including personal experiences that we have, bridging, given today's world. I think it's very common to have bridging experiences, I would think, on the regular. So I'm really excited to introduce the panel and have those discussions about personal or work experiences that may have occurred. And then really the main point of this, our experts here are going to stir the pot a little bit, but what we really want is to have full audience engagement here. That's the point of this panel, so that we can all really start to engage deeply. And also, I did want to say, happy Canadian Thanksgiving, everybody. All right? Juhi's down here, fine Canadian, and of course, Dave Nelson, who left, today is Canadian Thanksgiving, left his family and everything to be here with all of us, so I appreciate that. So, without any further ado, I will introduce Dr. Brita Roy, who's been with NOVA for quite some time now, certainly a veteran in the group. Who'll speak in and around the topic of connecting our current moment with innovative work bridging communities and healthcare systems. She certainly has been doing that, that's for sure. So thanks very much, Brita.
All right, well, first, I don't know if John is still here, but there he is. Well, I didn't get to say thank you for your talk, but thank you. It was truly wonderful and made me reflect a lot, actually, on my current experiences. So some, but not all of you know that not even 3 years ago yet, maybe but 2.5 years ago, I moved my family to the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. I'd never lived in New York City before, but there we were. And Sunset Park, for those of you who don't know, some of you might know of Brooklyn and have never heard of Sunset Park, despite it actually being a fairly large neighborhood of more than 150, maybe 170,000 people, because it is predominantly a low-income immigrant community. And there is no majority there. So this is the first place I personally have lived where there is actually no majority. Roughly half of the population speaks Chinese of some sort. And I say that to say, I actually learned about languages in China that I had not heard of before I moved there. Similarly, the other half of the population speaks Spanish or some sort of indigenous language from South America, again, languages I had never heard of before I moved there. And, then there's a few folks like me that are there as well. But even within the school systems, they have dual language programs. So the children learn one day in one language and the other day in another language. So they learn both languages as they're also learning material, math, literature, whatever it is, science. And everyone in this neighborhood is perfectly comfortable with that. Even though it's poor, it's safe. And when you walk down the street, people are speaking different languages, and you look around at the signs and they're in different languages, and that's all okay. So anyway, I found that this neighborhood really has created a true sense of belonging, right? They're not trying to same everybody. They're not trying to make everyone like everyone else, or everyone has to speak English and that's just the way it is, right? It is okay to be different, and we actually relish those differences and celebrate them. And so every week, our main street is shut down for some parade to celebrate, it's Mexico Day, it's Puerto Rico Day, it's Chinese Day, whatever it is. I can't even keep up with all the different celebrations. But I appreciate it. And I appreciate, honestly, that my children are now in this setting. And they will never, at least until they're older and move out, they won't ever themselves even feel othered, because everyone, is so different. Everyone belongs. So in this setting, I personally am in healthcare and academics and a researcher, and I work in population health and healthcare administration. And so the reason we moved there was because I took this position to try to create a community clinic linkage in this neighborhood with a hospital and set of federal health FQHC clinics that serve this population, acknowledging that for everyone in this community to really thrive, to really have better health and well-being, it really requires addressing both health and social needs. And so that was the goal. In addition, like I said, it's a relatively poor community, and so it is actually the neighborhood with the highest density of Medicaid recipients in the country. And so acknowledging that, we really had to think, I think it was back to John's first slide, how do we work together to build a bigger we, right? We can't work independently. That's not actually working, and we're falling short in many areas. So how do we work together to build a better we to foster health and well-being in our community, really through the creation of this community clinic linkage? And to do that, again, I'm not from this community, I don't share the background of a lot of people from this community, really just came at it with a sense of humility and recognizing a need to learn from everyone else that's here. And so some of you, I've had a few conversations, are familiar with system science and group model building, but that's really the approach that we took, where we brought together 40 to 50 people from healthcare services, both behavioral health and physical health, the social service sector, community-based services, and then just like people, living in the community, brought them all together to first create a or shared understanding, right, of the current systems. We first need to understand what it is that we're working with, right? What is working, what isn't working, what do we want, right? What do we need to do? And then from there, we can start co-creating that new system or co-creating the new integration across systems. And so we weren't allowed to have slides today, but I wish I could show you one picture. So I'm gonna try to illustrate it with a lot of gestures. So we created essentially a map of the current system, and what you would see is that there's essentially parallel processes of the healthcare service, right, delivery system, and then the social care service delivery system. Both of those systems are trying to identify needs of people in the community, either clinical health needs or social needs, right? And then they need to have the capacity to be able to deliver those services effectively to our population. So it also requires, right, being able to deliver those services in different languages or being sensitive to different cultures, right, to be able to do that. The healthcare service sector had the one additional component of cost, where when people come into the social service sector, they're not expected to pay. But in the healthcare sector, there is. So there's that additional kind of nuance there. But basically, very similar parallel processes, but they're parallel and working independently and really pretty distinctly from each other and don't talk to each other. So there's a clear need and recognition that we actually need a formal process that needs to be invested in to link these two services. So there were some ad hoc things happening, and we had started some processes on the health system side to screen people and refer them to community-based social service organizations to address social needs. But no one was actually really paying these people to do this work. It was an extra add-on to their existing job, right? Which means that they didn't actually have the capacity to do it, and it would be the first thing to fall to the wayside when the system gets overwhelmed. So that was one. It was a formal process that we need to invest in. But the second was the informal processes. So I mentioned these two parallel systems on either side and the linkage we need to create. But also in the center, there are informal processes where the communities themselves are working insularly to try to meet people's needs, right? They talk to their neighbors and friends that they know to try to get the help that they need, which is good to some extent, right? In that they're leveraging their own, social capital to be able to address their own needs. But in other ways, it can then insulate them and keep them from getting other additional services that would be further beneficial and bring in additional resources to the community. So the other thing that really was important that came up was actually leveraging those informal connections to connect to the formal services in a way that's non-threatening. Because again, as you can imagine, this community is highly fearful of deportation right now. And so in a way that is very safe and effective, comfortable, and would actually allow people to better meet the needs of themselves and their families. So we're now in the process of implementing the program and iteratively, honestly, and learning as we go. But I will say it was really that collective sense-making early on that was so important to this process. And that alone actually helped build bridges and create trust, right, among very different groups. And in the health system, that wasn't really trusted in this community to be able to really move forward in building this together. So I'll pause there.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah. So next up, we've got, and by the way, just real quick, I should have mentioned off the top that Steve Wolf couldn't be here with us today. You may see him there on the program as part of the panel. Tremendous experience in attempting to bridge very divergent political views as they relate to healthcare and health in general. I would encourage you to look up his work, Steve Wolf's work in the New York Times and also in JAMA and other editorials. A very courageous person and has made, sorry?
I was going to ask, can we get your slide?
Yeah, we can absolutely, and it is a heck of a slide too. Be prepared. It's like wearing X-ray glasses with those googly, there's so much information. So Steve Wolf, please do check out his work and his efforts at bridging in particular. So next up we've got Aterah. Wonderful to see you. You're going to talk about spirituality and inner development as a pathway for outer conversations, including understanding each other. So I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So first I'd like to thank Sue and Brian, obviously, for including me in this wonderful panel. And John, thank you for your wonderful keynote this morning. There were so many pertinent points that really landed. And I'm hoping some of my contribution here will connect with some of the things you said. So I'm going to focus on emergent possibilities for us individually and collectively, as Alan said, when we bridge our inner worlds with our outer worlds and our outer actions. And we've spoken about, well, where are we as a global community? We're more connected than ever. And John was talking about how we are so connected, so interconnected, and everything's going so fast. And we're not able to meet our global challenges in partnership. So just to give a couple of examples, we recently crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries that scientists say we need to stay within to maintain stable Earth systems to support life. We're falling far short of the United Nations 21 Sustainable Development Goals that 193 countries signed up to, and the goal was to meet them in 2030. And as again, what John pointed to and what we know is geopolitically, when there's instability in the politics of one area of the world, it often has direct and dire consequences in another. So we're at a point as a species where we need to move beyond the predominant operating mindset of separation, which plays out at the level of the individual, community, nation states, between other species and humanity, and the Earth itself. So I've been reading this wonderful French philosopher, Edgar Morin. He is 104 years old. And he has specialized in complexity theory. And one of the things he talks about is that we've been living in a planetary era for a long time. And right now we're in the planetary Iron Age. And for us to come out of this planetary Iron Age, we really need to come together beyond our differences. And we need to become planetary citizens with planetary consciousness. And we need to evolve our institutions to address our collective issues at the level of the planet. So I'm going to draw upon some of my own experience and interest in the evolution of consciousness and culture, and our emerging planetary health work at the Harvard Osher Center for Integrative Health, where we appreciate the connection between inner values and outer action. I'm going to speak to John's themes of othering, belonging, bridging, narrative, and finding common ground through the integral philosopher Ken Wilber's lens of stages of development of waking up, cleaning up, growing up, and showing up. So first on the themes of othering and belonging. So John, I'm sure you would agree that othering starts inside ourselves. We other ourselves consciously and unconsciously. And at a deep level, when we look inside, we see that there's a part of us that has this need to distinguish itself from its environment. From an Eastern spiritual perspective, this is the ego, which has a fundamental need to see itself as separate. And from a Western psychological perspective, we can also see this as a self-organizing principle to maintain coherence. So in and of themselves, they make sense. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's when we identify solely with a separate sense of self to the exclusion of our interconnection with the fabric of life, with the fabric of consciousness, with love, with life itself, with divine spirit, if you call it that, whatever it is that gives rise to reality. When we separate ourselves through this identification solely with the separate self, that's when we have this issue. And the religious and spiritual journey is essentially realizing that we were never separate in the first place. So we could say that this deep, unconscious divide in our being is the seed of all other forms of othering. So when we recognize that we're not separate in an ontological sense, then we've got the potential to see the same essence in each other, in our fellow human beings and non-human beings, and recognize that we all belong here on a fundamental level. This, in the integral frame, is waking up. And it can be realized when the separate sense of self is suspended, even if it's just momentarily. And this can happen through meditation, it can happen through contemplation, when we're in a flow state, if we experience awe in nature, or go on a psychedelic trip. However it happens, the fundamental nature of waking up is that we experience a dimension of self which is beyond our mind's ability to grasp. And it's when our individuated sense of self, the boundaries dissolve. So this is waking up. And I'm sure many people have had some experiences where we touch on that. When we were speaking this morning about values, we were getting the deep kind of connection that people had with time and timelessness and presence and beauty in those moments, which were really profound. I think those are entry points to that kind of dimension. So othering at the level of self also happens when we exile part of our own personality, aspects that we don't like about ourselves, that don't align with the self-image that we've constructed over time. And these are our shadows. And when we act out of our shadows unconsciously, we inflict pain on others. And it requires courage. It requires befriending those shadows in ourselves so that they become conscious. That process engenders compassion for ourselves and each other. It gives us the capacity to pause and reflect and act instead of react. So I was connecting this to John's theme of bridging, because then we're bridging in ourselves first and foremost, which gives us the capacity to then bridge with others. And we can do this through mindfulness meditation, through therapy, just getting to know ourselves, getting to know all those parts of ourselves that we don't like about ourselves, and embracing them. Through the integral framework, this is called cleaning up. And then moving to narrative. Again, we spoke about what kind of narratives are we telling ourselves, what stories are there. At the moment, we're experiencing a clash of multiple worldviews on a global level. We have traditional, modern, and postmodern cultures that are alive in us and between us. And we need a meta-narrative which helps us move beyond the patriarchal, materialistic, mechanistic, and hyper-individuated values that these represent, while still making room for the coexistence of healthy expressions of all of those predominant worldviews. So we're not excluding them, we're embracing them, but we're actually passing apart, well, what is healthy and what is unhealthy? So metamodernity is one such possible narrative. It's becoming more recognized as a new cultural level of development, which can oscillate between and hold opposing values that would previously polarize us, such as holding science and sacred as not contradictory. this is an example of growing up through the integral lens, where the stories we tell ourselves are based on our own efforts to question and develop our own values and perspectives, so we can hold a more complex view on life and be more inclusive of others with different worldviews. And then finally, the theme of finding common ground. So at the level of, I might be stretching a little bit here, at the level of physical, biological, and social evolution, extraordinary leaps can happen at times of incredible turbulence and conflicting interests. So let's take, for example, the eukaryotic cell came into being by a prokaryotic host cell engulfing an aerobic bacterium, but that led to the symbiotic development of complex life. And then you look at the development of language, which allowed cooperation and mutual understanding where it was previously hard. And then the creation of the United Nations. It was born out of and after the profound devastation wrought by warfare. So these emergencies happen at times of conflict. So small changes in an unstable system can flip the whole system into a new phase. And I think we spoke about that as well. We touched on that. And I'm thinking perhaps underneath the current global instability, we're seeing that there are stirrings of a deeper coming together. And again, the binding common element is once again the planet that we all call home, that we all share. Every single living being is connected to the planet. And there are many communities of practice which are beginning to emerge, including Nova's Earthrise community, which in their own way are trying to realize a greater connection with the planet that can give rise to a more ecological consciousness. And this is where we can recognize that we not only belong to the earth, but again, as John said this morning, we are earth made human, humus. So just before coming, so I'm just wrapping up here, but just before coming to this meeting, some of you will know that the Planetary Health Alliance that we're affiliated with held its annual meeting in Rotterdam. There were like hundreds of people there, and they're coming together to address our impact on the planet and human health. And right after this meeting, in Sweden, there's going to be the Inner Development Goals Summit, which is going to take place in Sweden. Again, drawing hundreds of people, and they're really trying to explore this interface of how do we develop our inner skills and capacities so that we can meet our sustainable development goals. So these are just a couple of examples of networks coming together with networks to weave together new stories of connection, inclusivity, diversity, sovereignty, and novelty. And this is emergent work. It's what, in the integral lens, is then called showing up, where our inner work informs our outer work to make a collective difference. So I'm really interested in this model of like, if we're willing to wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up, then perhaps we can actually become planetary citizens like Edgar Morin is pointing to, and become architects for this more positive world that we actually want to see. So thank you.
Thanks a million. Thank you, Aterah. That was lovely. And next up, we've got our Kate of podcast fame, although certainly not a conflict entrepreneur, that's for sure. Wonderful journalist. She's going to talk about meeting people where they are. And deep listening, and you don't get to New York Times bylines without deep listening. So thanks, Kate.
Thank you. So I want to talk about one of the most significant examples, I think, and impactful in our current moment types of othering, and that's the rural-urban divide. It's a big part of what I set out to grapple with when I proposed an entire year of reporting Appalachian stories, which Nova also felt to be a noble prospect. And so a little over 2 years ago, I suggested in my media fellowship proposal that I would write a story about black lung. Far from being a relic of history, that disease has been exploding across Appalachia, and it's not just felling men in their 60s and 70s anymore, now it's killing them before 40. I published that story this summer, and it was front page on the weekend edition of the New York Times with additional audio commentary and a big full-color spread inside the national section. And that kind of buy-in from a paper like the Times was like an endorsement of this wider idea that this story has consequences and ramifications outside Appalachia, that it matters to America. And that felt triumphant. And then there was the comment section. For every thoughtful, nuanced reply, there were a dozen, why can't these people learn to stay out of the mines? And they get what they voted for. It was a perfect illustration of how decades of media messaging has warped perspectives, and it brought me face to face with how much damage there is to undo. I do believe it is undoable, but we've got to understand how we got here. Across cultures and epics, storytelling has always shaped our world. And in the modern era, the stories that are repeated in headlines shape how we describe ourselves and our neighbors, the things we care about, and the things we believe. And for a long time, rural stories have been flattened, misunderstood, and misrepresented by national narratives. And now we're all at the edge of a great divide. I grew up, not rurally, but in New Jersey, a place with stereotypes all its own. In 2007, Diane Sawyer came to the town where I was born, where my family roots go back a couple of generations, and put a tour of its burned-out row homes and its fatherless families on 60 Minutes. In 2013, just after I'd graduated college and moved home to Camden County and started writing for a local paper, Matt Taibbi penned a feature for Rolling Stone headlined, "Apocalypse, New Jersey, a dispatch from America's most desperate town." I was so angry and heartbroken that this vibrant place with, yes, some major problems, but also a place that I knew as the home of amazing innovators and organizers was suddenly invisible, reduced and categorized as hopeless. And that's the same thing that's been happening to rural communities for the last century or more with enormous consequence. These portrayals have shaped not only policy, but how rural America is seen and how rural America sees itself. In the early 20th century, magazines and newspapers began sending writers and photographers out into the mountains and across the plains, and what they sent back for their mostly urban audience weren't portraits of stunning natural landscapes full of small businesses, churches, music, culture, things that are as true now as they were then, but instead they focused on scenes of poverty. Photos of haunted, hungry mothers and barefoot kids in a backward place. And in an era when poverty was being culturally aligned with immorality, those people were portrayed as lazy, uneducated, and prone to violence. And for audiences in cities miles away who might never have occasion to experience those places, those stories were powerful, and they justified a whole wave of intervention, from missionaries to industrialists who saw opportunity to extract wealth. And in the winter of 1964, when President Johnson stood on her front porch in eastern Kentucky and declared a war on poverty, it cemented for the rest of the nation the idea that rural America simply couldn't take care of itself. Coverage often gave little context or explanation for how systemic neglect, corporate exploitation, and absent government investment created those conditions. Pop culture fed the fire with shows like the Beverly Hillbillies, movies like Deliverance, and on, recycling those tropes for new generations, stories of dysfunction, despair, and pathology. And rural America became a kind of canvas onto which the rest of the country could project its anxieties, a somewhere else to put all that ailed us, and a nebulous place to which it was possible to feel no relationship and no responsibility. You can imagine then how people could lose faith, begin to mistrust the media, the urban centers where most of it originates, the people who live in those places, the politicians who only ever seem to visit those places or direct resources to those places. You can understand how they would feel invisible, how they would feel abandoned, and then angry. And then when someone suggests that it might be better to just blow up the whole system, you can understand why that starts to sound like a good idea. The division has grown wide and deep and dangerous, and it was narrative that got us here. Yes, and. Storytelling matters now more than ever. Journalism, when done well, can help promote public health. It can rebuild trust in our institutions. It can draw attention to problems, encourage people to seek care, and more importantly, draw attention to solutions, and that in turn can grow support and investment for them. And in rural places where so many people have been told for so long that their voices do not matter, storytelling can be an act of power, of reclamation of power, and a radical reforming of connection and community. And this community can do plenty to help. All of you traffic in information. Many of you are scientists and researchers. And information is good. Data shows us patterns, it helps us allocate resources, it exposes systemic problems. But it's the context that makes us care. Data and research are critical, invaluable tools, but they do not change hearts and minds. Only human stories can do that. So here's what we can do with that. In the course of your work, you can try to recognize when there's a story that deserves telling. You can be connectors to voices that you know should be heard. When I was reporting that black lung story, the only reason that miners and their families spoke to me, invited me into their homes, and told me what they were really experiencing was because they trust their pulmonologist, a remarkable man named Drew Harris, who trusted and vouched for me. So you can build relationships with journalists. You can vet them yourself and then help facilitate their reporting. But also, as people in the scientific community, you can say yes to interviews, even if you've been burned before, because the only way to rebuild faith in the media is to have faith in the media. The most important thing that I think we, the people, all need to do is just listen and ask rather than tell. So what that looks like for me in my work is that now, instead of going into stories assuming that I know the framing and I'm seeking characters to fit that narrative, I invite input. Sometimes, a lot of the time now, I call people up and just say, I was hoping you could tell me what the story is here. So I start the conversation and then I just shut up for a while. So we can all be doing that on an interpersonal level and on a systemic one. And that's a thing that sounds simple, but actually requires a lot of vulnerability and a willingness to just get out there on the bridge and stand there in the open air for a while. But if we can do it, then eventually I think we might find ourselves back on common ground. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. And next we would invite John just to provide a little bit more reflection, if you're up for it. But if you want, we can go straight to, there's a really vibrant audience out there that is not at all suffering from the post-lunch dip. So,
No one is asleep.
Well, I took a bunch of notes. Mainly I just say thank you to all of you for picking up and already doing key themes in your work. Themes around bridging, themes around collective meaning making and trust, themes around looking at these boundaries of separation and how we think of them. I guess one thing I would say in terms of order, two things I'll say. People sometimes ask, when do you bridge? And I believe virtually no one can bridge all the time. Although I have a hat which says bridger as opposed to bridging. I mean, it's something we aspire to. And reflecting back on something George said this morning, when Eleanor Roosevelt pushed for the UN Declaration of Human Rights, she got into a big tiff with brilliant American sociologist W.B. Du Bois. His position was that this is just symbolic, that Africa was colonized, women couldn't vote around the world, blacks were still being lynched and terrorized in the South and throughout the country. So what do you mean universal Declaration of Human Rights? This is 1947 and 8, after the worst world war in human history, and 6 million Jews killed because they were Jews. So what do you mean Declaration of Human Rights? This is just symbolic. And I've said many times that as much as I've learned and respect Du Bois, he was right and he was wrong. He was right that it was symbolic. He was wrong that it was just. Today we have thousands and thousands of laws and rules and norms around the Declaration of Human Rights. So I think as we sort of lay down these principles, they're made at this point feel like they're just symbolic, but they're not if we do it right. And the last thing I want to say is that, and this is a larger conversation, but to me there's no order. So especially in terms of spiritual practice, a lot of people believe you start internally and then you move externally. I don't adhere to that myself. I cite Don Cherry, who's a jazz flutist, and he has this line where he says, the outside is not, the inside is too. Nice Zen koan. But I don't think there's an order between inside and outside. And if we think about feminist literature, feminists would say the self, which we might think of as the inside, is socially constructed by the community. So it's not prior to the community, and therefore can't. So anyway, I just think that's a more interesting conversation. And I'll end by just saying, Loretta Ross, who spoke at our conference, and some of you may know her, she wrote a book about cancel culture. She's also a rape survivor and a black woman who went back to college in her 60s. And she's become famous. And there was a rapist in prison who wrote her a letter. And in the letter he said, I hate myself. Out in the large world, I rape women. In prison, I rape men. And I just hate myself. Would you come help me? I'm sick. And she spoke at our conference, and she went. And someone asked the question, didn't you first have to heal yourself before you could help heal him? And her answer was absolutely not. That the engaging with him is how she moved to heal herself. Now, I'm not saying that's true for everyone. Now, she did say she needed some self-medication, which means drugs, to do this, so it wasn't easy. But I just want to caution on having it being linear. I think it's messier than that. We think of systems, they move in multiple directions at once.
Thanks very much, John. So this is now the time to turn it over for some really good conversation. And I know you're all got burning questions. What an amazing group of experts we have here. Thank you so much for all of your input. Who wants to be first? Yeah, all right, good.
There you go.
Well, first of all, not an expert. So I like what John, just to respond to what you're saying, because just to speak to that, I totally agree with you. In terms of, if we look at non-duality, the whole point of non-duality is it's non-dual. It's like they're one and the same, the reflection of one or the other. But I also like, because I think it goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, that belonging is an active process. So it's a co-creative process, and I think in terms of everything that I was saying in terms of the spiritual, it's not confined to an inner dimension. It is a co-creative process with the inner and the outer, and where there isn't a bias. That's the whole point, that there is no separation between the inner and the outer. So I just appreciated you clarifying that.
Okay, so George has got a question. Trent, you got it? Thanks.
Hi. Kate, as always, I love to hear you speak because you are so poetic in your way of expressing yourself. I did have a question about what you may call the dual-edged sword of narrative. And the poverty program, I think, is an interesting example of that. Now, my understanding is that Michael Harrington's portrayal of urban poverty was very influential in, I hope I don't have the timing right, wrong rather, in convincing Lyndon Johnson to get behind the anti-poverty program. And for all its warts in the anti-poverty program, it did actually improve the lives of many people. So there's kind of a, how do we balance that out?
Can I borrow that? Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I that's such a salient point, because the war on poverty and everything born of that in terms of like public health infrastructure and the entire progressive era essentially is like so much good came of that, and there were real quantifiable differences for communities. But from a cultural like narrative standpoint, it can't be ignored that it was like, we're gonna bring the solution to you. We'll come in and we'll fix the problem that you've created by being lazy and prone to violence and poor. And like I mentioned, for so long, and kind of even still, that poverty is like aligned in this really deep way with immorality. And that's where we get all these notions of like, well, just work harder. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? But so I think that what's missing then is the jump from there to recognizing that so many of the like real lasting solutions are coming from within these communities, that these communities are like very capable of, generating their own help, like of helping themselves, but need investment. Like that's not to say that like any of us can do anything alone, right? So that's kind of the idea, is like we want to keep the good parts, right, and jettison the misrepresentation and the like, misunderstood aspects, and instead acknowledge and celebrate that, especially rural communities. And this is why I think it's so, I mean, you can zoom out, like this isn't just about Appalachia, it's about rural communities in general, and it's about places, and so I think if we can celebrate and acknowledge and like support what's happening already on the ground, and that extends to like local journalism. I mean, oh my God, what a huge impact if we could find ways to support local journalism, because like writers and editors who are from these places and of these places do not fall victim to the same kinds of misrepresentation and mischaracterization. So like from the jump, they're doing a better job at this. But we've lost something like a third of US newspapers at this point, most of them in the last like 2 decades. So if this is like the voice of these people in these communities, now that voice is silenced too. So it's like we're not moving in the right direction here. So yeah, in short, yes, so much good came out of those programs, and that should continue, and we could take that as a lesson and model new programs off of that, and a lot of that's happening in those communities, but like sans the kind of investment that they need to like actually, achieve.
And I'd just like to make the point, you had mentioned something in the comments section. I go straight to the comments section.
I know I'm not supposed to, but
you're not supposed to, but I love doing that because you really get, there's just so much richness there of how people are thinking. And you mentioned one of the comments, which was, they are getting what they deserve.
Oh, not just one. I mean, there were so many.
And that is a pervasive line of thinking for many things. We talk about pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which you mentioned. We talk about how there is this impulse to punish. And the impulse to punish, right, or what Robert Sapolsky, a Stanford biologist, calls the joy of punishment, because it's really a psychological and biological phenomena. That's something we really have to address. The roots of that. Where does it come from? Why are we like that? Because that maintains a status quo. And I really feel like that there's a real power there. And also to the point of rural, and someone can look it up in real time, but it's my understanding that approximately 90% of all counties in the United States voted for DJT. I can look it up, but I'm pretty sure it's in the 90% rate.
I think it's 94 plus.
94% of all counties. This is what Kate is saying just now, wrapping up, is so powerful, because these are the points of intersection that we need to be at. So I see Dave with a question back there.
It's more just a comment. To follow through on that line of thinking, I think it's very important that we reflect on how we got to now. So there are decades of antecedents that lead up to moments like these, and if we fail to, either through voluntary ignorance or creative head sanding, by doing that, we don't actually confront the issues, and that's the issues of, frankly, rural communities not being heard. This is very similar in Canada. Mm-hmm. So you have regionality of ruralism. Urban centers tend to vote a little bit more liberal, and I live in the dairy capital of Canada. I'm surrounded by cornfields and cows, right? So the flavor is very different, and they haven't been heard. And I think that you're right. They moved to a point of frustration, then they got angry, and so they decided to vote accordingly. And so Canada has a similar tension. And then just remember, it's not regionally bound. These quote-unquote populist ideas are reflective of groups that have not been heard, hence Brian suggesting we all do a little bit more deep listening. I think it's incumbent upon us, but it's probably a requisite for society too, if we can somehow translate that desire to listen to other people as a contagious thing.
I would just very briefly also add that it doesn't have to be We don't just have to be talking about like stories on the front page of the New York Times. Like think about what was on television 50 years ago, right? Stories about people living in, like, I mean, Little House on the Prairie, for God's sake, right? Or like PBS shows about farmers that people love to watch and now would be considered outdated and quaint and, you know, totally outmoded, right? But like that was representation that we just like don't have anymore. And that's broad swaths of the country who just don't see themselves represented, whether it's in news, in pop culture, in, you know, halls of power. And like we can change that. Really, we can start.
More questions? Oh, good. We got this side involved here. Good. Cindy, go to you first.
I'm going to just speak because I don't know exactly what the question is yet. But Kate, as you were speaking, I was hearing the same like underlying narrative and mental models that are used for inner city youth or whatever it might be. And I've heard it in different variations in the health department. Why are these people making themselves sick, right? So I see all the commonality about different groups. So for you talking today, it's about rural communities. We keep on doing it and replicating it in multiple different fashions. We then fight along the, you know, kind of the surface around who should be represented and go back and forth about that. But when I discuss elements of structural racism, it's not for it to be specific for this, it's that we have a larger way that we are operating and mental models that we are utilizing in blaming and invisibilizing certain populations based on whatever is, you know, what we want to do at that point. How do we build, and this might be for everyone, right? How do we build narratives that where everyone belongs?
Brita, I feel like you have.
I might speak to that a little bit. So another body of work I have is actually around addressing the issue of gun violence in urban and small urban centers. And they're similar to your point, right? There is a similar narrative and similar story that they're poor, they're X-color, these youth, you know, they're just creating these systems of violence, right? And therefore deserve it, right? I mean, that is part of the narrative. And I'm not as eloquent as Kate, and I'm not in media, so I don't think I can personally like shift the narrative in the media. That said, there is actually research on how the news, even like local news stories, are portrayed. And how both perpetrators and victims of gun violence are portrayed in the media, and how that actually influences rates of violence, and potentially how that actually re-traumatizes victims and their families themselves. So there are ways we could actually shift how we report on these issues to maybe even, I mean, it hasn't actually been tested yet, but it could be tested to see, like, does this actually reduce rates of violence in the long run? And some of my work also using group model building with people from these communities and reframing it actually in a positive light, right? Not violence itself, but saying you as a community have strengths. And instead of thinking of, because people internalize this, right? Just like internalize racism. Like people internalize the fact that they're poor and therefore, you know, can't do certain things. But flipping that and saying, we have great strengths in this community. What can we build upon? What can we actually leverage to recreate systems for ourselves? And again, tap into other resources to bring into the community, but it's our decision. And we're creating this together has really reframed how many neighborhoods have been able to create their own narrative and bring in different resources or bond together to better use resources that they have to address some of the underlying issues to then reduce rates of violence or other local community issues. And again, really in and of themselves and not relying on other sources.
So I'll just add a couple of things. Part of it we talked about earlier in terms of belonging is partially co-creation. So telling stories about someone is different than listening to them telling their own stories. And so part of it, you want to make sure their voice is actually there, telling their stories, not just for them, that's important, but also for the nation as a whole. Now, I'll just add a couple of complexities. I'm going to have to address them now, but they should be added. Poverty in the United States is first of all, it's deeply racialized. So if you think about, and I wrote about this, the war on drugs, which really was started by Nixon but then accelerated by Reagan. I wrote a piece back then saying it really was a war on black people. There was no public perception that there was a drug problem. Literally, it was like 3%, it was nothing. And at the same time, you remember, those of you who follow this, Reagan talked about the deserving poor. So that's a very interesting thing. So here we have the divide. Now you have to figure out who are the deserving and who are the undeserving. And it was clear that undeserving was partially racialized. One of the things I'm at Berkeley, and so Hofschild, the book in terms of strangers in their own land, focusing on Louisiana. And I think the work is very interesting, and she's a friend. I have one beef, maybe more than one, but my family's from the South. 25% of rural America are not white. In the South, that number goes up to sometimes 40%. When we talk about rural poverty, the image that comes to mind is white. We actually, so not only are poor people, and I think certainly Appalachia, I lived in Ohio, is mistreated in all kinds of ways. I've actually said, I wonder why they even call themselves white. I mean, they have all these sort of indicators that we associate with black. But it's a double invisibility. You're invisible because you're poor and rural, but then if you're black, rural, and poor, forget it. So I want that richness of those stories to come out. The last thing I'll say is that a lot of really good research, it's really starting in Europe, but also migrating to the United States, about concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty, as it was rolled out in the United States, was deeply urbanized. It was really early deindustrialization. I'm from Detroit. Jobs really moving from Detroit to other places. And then this whole pathology of the black family that came out of that. I mean, just books after books after books about absent fathers and the pathology. And then when it finally moved into the white community, it became deindustrialization. The same phenomena, but a whole different way of describing it. And so one thing I think we could do, just as by way of example, and I was frustrated that no one ever took me up on it, as poverty became more vicious in rural communities, we also start talking about the meth problem, the drug problem. It was largely described as poverty of despair or death by despair and a health problem. It was not talked about as a criminal problem. And I'm saying, wait a minute, we just had the same phenomenon in the black community and the whole thing was lock people up. When it moved to the rural community, it was like, oh, not good enough, but help these helpless people. And I'm saying, why aren't we tying those two stories? They're the same story. Why aren't we tying those two communities together and those stories together? And I was frustrated because I never saw it done in a way that I thought was robust enough.
So I've tried to do that in different ways, and I'm not there. It's not there. So I feel like we have to continue to bring these stories together, but I guess different people speaking. I don't know.
I just really quick, the way that I'm doing it, just me, is I'm working really hard at letting people tell their own story. So it's kind of not easy, but it's a lot of the time a story starts with some study or data or statistics, and that's how I'm like convincing an editor that this is a thing, right? Like with the numbers and like, look how many people are affected, look how stark these realities are, whatever. And then I'm getting an interview with an expert to say that this thing is a thing, right? And it feels like you have to do that to sell a pitch. But then when it comes to time to write the story, I'm trying really hard to make sure that the vast majority of the voices that are in that story, because like ultimately, like yes, I'm objective. It's objective journalism, right? What I'm doing is not advocacy, but at the end of the day, like I'm still determining the lens through which my reader sees this story. So I can be as objective as I want to be, but ultimately, I'm still the one who decides whose voice is in the story. Right? So I'm trying so hard to like let people tell their own story and let it be dominated by those voices, and just kind of use the voices of the people who are studying those people and that phenomenon as like backup to and then the other thing is like I'm trying really hard to make sure I'm telling the whole story. So a really good, very quick example is like I've got another piece. It's coming into like final edits. It's another New York Times piece. It's about midwifery in Appalachia and how there's this return to this really long-standing tradition. I mean, listen, this is how in 1910, like 98% of people were born at home, and they were all born with midwives. Like we didn't go to the hospital to have babies. And then there's like this whole thing with, the Shepherd-Towner Act gets passed in 1920, and it gives money to poor states, but only if they'll establish programs that like trained midwives and like they long and short of it is they wanted to abolish the midwife. So then there's this woman in eastern Kentucky, her name is Mary Breckinridge, and she starts basically like the Pony Express of midwifery. She brings in all these nurses who have just been, World War I nurses trained in Europe, and she brings them to eastern Kentucky. She trains them in midwifery. She puts them on horseback, and she sends them out to these poor families, and she's often called like the mother of American midwifery, or like the angel on horseback, et cetera, et cetera. And then she starts the first graduate school of midwifery in the United States, which still exists. It persists today. Awesome, right? Except she's also a eugenicist and like a very vocal racist who refuses to A, train black midwives, or B, serve black women. So then now black women are just like on their own, and this all happened in the 1920s until she died. In the 60s, her graduate school did not accept a single black midwifery trainee. And today in the United States, 7%, that's it, 7% of midwives are black. That's it. And so like women who would like their baby to be caught or would like to be guided through this like, through labor with someone who looks like them are like shit out of luck in most places it's because of this systemic history, right? So anyway, when I was like researching this story, at the outset of this story, what I thought the story was there's these maternal care deserts that are widening, and in the hospital in eastern Kentucky named for Mary Breckinridge, there is no labor and delivery unit. You can't have a baby there. And isn't this the like fount of midwifery and whatever? And then it wasn't until I was like, wait, but we need to figure out what the whole story was. And the fact that she was like a straight up eugenicist was a footnote that is actually such an important part of that story. So for just me and my work, like I'm working real hard to elevate those voices and working really hard to make sure that because of me and my background and what where I tend to go first, I'm not like missing the other half of the story.
Nadine, did you have a question?
First, a thank you to all of you. Hi, I can barely see you on the end there. I'll scoot a little bit. I guess, my question was kind of similar to Zinzi, so I'll ask a different one. But how do you hold the humanity of the person or group that you may be working with when their perspectives may be so incredibly disparate from your own? I mean, I think thinking about just mounting division in the world today and some of the, I know Kate and I were talking at lunch about not being able to fathom what would compel someone to turn their neighbor into ice. And it's like how when you are dealing with that type of individual, do you retain the lens of their own humanity? Like, what does that look like? How do you navigate that? And like, where are the inroads? Where are the bridges? Like, we're talking about rural Appalachia and, 94% of those groups having voted for Trump and maybe understanding what may have led them there. But like, where are the little cracks to be able to kind of have discourse arise and like come back to a place where we can then maybe have productive dialogue? Thanks.
I don't know. My own approach is just really just approach it from truly a place of curiosity. So I'm usually not even sharing my views, just asking the why, and then even if they might tell me why, and I still might not understand, I might like probe and ask for more, and try to better understand, not necessarily, we'll say like voting for Trump, not why did you vote for Trump, but what is it about your current circumstance that you're unhappy with? What would you like to see, right? And then more often than not, they actually have similar goals and outcomes to what we might be trying to achieve. So another, I guess, frame that I take to the work or these conversations is a frame of well-being. So everyone, right, wants the highest level of well-being for themselves, for their family, for their communities. And it's not just health, right? It's really being able to do the things you enjoy doing. And so again, with that kind of shared base and understanding and commonality, I guess, I feel I'm able to engage in those conversations in a way that's not hostile, in a way that I can suspend my own personal judgment or way I might do things, and instead just think about the outcomes and then what do you want and how would you get there, and then maybe I might engage with like have you thought about this, which might be a way I might go about it that's different, and maybe they have thought about it and they reject it for some reason, and that's still important to know. And so again, it's not always 100%, but at least it's a way to, I feel like, make some progress in having conversations with people that might have a very different perspective.
I swear I'll be succinct. The answer to the first half of your question, for me anyway, is there was this book, and it was like required reading for a journalism ethics course, I think my freshman year in college. But anyway, it was called Freedom for the Thought That We Hate. And it was just like a really straightforward treatise on the First Amendment. And there's, oh boy, who am I quoting? I may hate what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Is that Walter Cronkite? I think it's Cronkite. Anyway, it's like, that's my sort of ethos, right? Is that like, we can fundamentally disagree, and I can think that what you have to say is like full on hateful. And I will defend with every waking breath your right to get up and say it, because your right's the same as mine. And so I feel the same way about like beliefs and values, and especially like political leanings and things like that. Like, if I want mine to be respected and allowed, and like if I want to be safe to feel any kind of way that I feel, they have to be safe to feel the way that they feel, and I have to defend their right to feel it, like proactively. And so that's really hard sometimes, I think, but the way that I think about it is, if I'm defending what they have to say, even if it's vile, actually what I am doing is defending my right to say what I have to say. So I'm defending us, not just them and not just me. So, and just really fast, I think where the bridges are, I think the bridges are really little. They are for me. The bridges are like cabbage moths. right? So I was like in this holler, and I'm serious, I was in this holler in Pike County, Kentucky with this family who like, I mean, it was like weird that I even drove down their road because, you know, and they were really standoffish and like very hesitant to have me and my photographer right, you know, there and reticent. But they were like gardening when I showed up, and I just kind of was like, those cabbages are amazing. All of mine get eaten up by cabbage moths. Like, what are you doing that I'm not doing? And so I have my recording from this reporting trip is like, there's a whole hour where we're just talking about cabbage moths. Like, we're not talking about black lung, we're not talking about politics, we're talking about cabbage moths. And that's where the bridge is, because we're just two people who grow cabbages, right? Just like me and my neighbor whose barn is painted Trump in 9-foot tall letters are both moms who want the world to be whole and safe for our children. Like, the bridges are I think, I like to start small anyway, and I think we find a way in, right?
So just very quickly, I think I completely agree with what's been said. One of the things that's sometimes not clear is that when you're bridging, especially at a deep level, you're not trying to convince the other person of anything. So that's sometimes what we start off with. It's like, this person has such vile ideas, I have to convince them that they're wrong. That's not bridging. Now, it's more persuasion. Persuasion has its place, but it's not bridging. So at a deep level, when you bridge, what you're doing is that word, sawabano, you're listening to the person. Now, you may want to be listened to as well, but you're listening to the person. And here's the contradiction. I work with a lot of organizers, and a lot of them have, now deep bridging and long bridges has become part of the organizing community. Here's the contradiction. If you're trying to convince someone, you're not really bridging. Organizers only organize by trying to convince someone. But here's what the literature says. Experiments show that if you can deeply listen to someone, your effectiveness for changing them goes up substantially higher than trying to persuade them directly. So it's a contradiction, right? If I don't try to persuade you, then I'm likely to persuade you. If I try to persuade you, I'm not. So literally, when I work with organizers, they say, so the trick is to pretend like, right, exactly, that I really care about who you are, so I can get you to be somebody who you're not. I said, no, it can't be pretending. I mean, it really is a profoundly interesting spiritual thing. And then the other thing, sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, so you have to assess your own place. Very quick story. Working with a large group of Trump supporters in rural Arkansas around the Affordable Care Act and stuff. All of them are against it. My host invites me out, 600 people there. Literally, they're very energetically hostile, right? I can just feel it. And I walk out on stage. Before I walk out, my host says to me, oh yeah, we had someone here last month talking about a similar topic. They got booed off the stage. But good luck. And so I started the conversation by telling a lie. I started off by saying, it's really wonderful to be here. But then I said, instead of me giving my formal remarks, what I'd like to do is just go around the room and have you talk about your own experience. And if you share that experience, I want you to stand up. And so people talked about that experience with the healthcare system. And they told about being denied because they lost their job, the insurance company not covering them. They had a pre-existing condition. And 2 or 3 other examples. And by now, all 600 of them are standing up. And they're pissed. I said, how does this feel? I talked about their feelings. And they said, we hate the insurance company, those MFs. And then I say, this is what the Affordable Care Act is trying to fix. And it's complete silence. Anyway, by the end of it, they all love me. They're asking the host, can I come back? And the host said, how did you do that? And I did what Kate was just saying. I elicited their stories from them, and I was interested in it. And that opened up a bridge. So again, you can't do it just for that reason, but it's effective. So there you have it.
I know, Ashka, you had one question. I think we're coming up on time, right? Any timekeepers in the house?
Can I just respond to one thing that John said, just in relationship to what you're saying? I'm thinking of the context of whole person health. And there's the phrase now that is quite common where they're not asking what's the matter with you, but what matters to you. So I think really engaging that way is the bridge.
Please.
Well, thank you. I mean, the insights were quite breathtaking. I also saw a theme which I just want to name it. And, it may be the proliferation of narcotics, war on drugs, the black lung, the inequities in the healthcare system. Othering is popular because it's immensely profitable. Division is where shareholder dividends are fed. So when we're living in this economic structure, aka neoliberal capitalism, which is sort of an extension of colonialism in many ways, I mean, what we are discussing today and we shall tomorrow is beautiful. It's like I'm having chills go through my spine. And outside this space, there is a massive geopolitical architecture that is designed on commodifying every word we speak, every feeling we feel, every thought we have. So how do we, I heard you say about radical shift, like reimagination, reconstruction. And still, I think we haven't been able to call out what capitalism has done to our consciousness. When people like Mamdani come to the fore, I mean, we really lose our minds. I mean, we really do not know how to respond to anything that challenges the religion of the 21st century, which is, again, the fact that markets have minds. They don't. But we believe, and we have created the entire social, cultural phenomenon around believing that they do. So what are your thoughts about this? Maybe this is not the greatest last question, but...
Blimey. I mean, we could all speak to this, but I really do think it does go down to we need a spiritual revolution. You just said that it's the religion of the 21st century, capitalism. It's become that. And, people are unconscious about it, but we're in that system. So I think we do have to go deeper, inside and outside, both. It's what is our collective commons? What is the reflection of? It's a reflection of our values. So it's like, where do we go for finding something different? We have to find it in each other, in ourselves. We have to find it in something that's bigger than ourselves. We have to find in the natural world the connection. We need to reconnect with the natural world, with ourselves, with each other, with the spiritual urge that's inside all of us. It is real, and we've kind of suffocated that with capitalism, right? So it's this juggernaut that's just going. And we were just talking about it at lunch, right? We were saying, if we keep feeding that narrative, that's the narrative that's going to prevail. We have to switch the narrative. And we do that through our own agency, and all the stories that we're telling here. It's like we have an agency in that to play and move it forward differently to, we're being told that AI is here and this is the way things are. This is the way, we have to fit in. We don't have to fit in. We have to find a way to actually make that different. So.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And both parties are undergoing tremendous movement. It's so dynamic. It's not just on the Republican side where you've had this phenomena. The Democrat Party is also undergoing quite a change at the moment as well. So everything's in flux, and that's where the opportunity, it's been said many times here. That's where the opportunity resides. Yeah.
So it's a really important question, and it's a big question, but that's why I put in there about institutions. And I have this thing, people may have heard me say it, of being, why I advocate that we should be hard on structures and soft on people. And instead we're hard on people and soft on structures. So we don't pay attention to work the structures are doing. Instead we sort of look for the racist or the bigot, which is not unimportant, but that's not really what's perpetuating what's going on by and large. I would also say, in many ways, you can think about when people talk about a move to the right, here and across the world, it's oftentimes talk about a politics of resentment. And so I think the good news is most people who have moved to the far right, they do so as a way of trying to belong. So that really the roots of what's going on, people, it's like we're saying to the Proud Boys, if you want to belong, you have to get rid of the Jews. You're saying to the Christian nationalists, if you want to belong, you have to get rid of the Muslims and the immigrants. But they're trying to belong. They're doing it in a bad way, or in a defective way, and that's why we talk about belonging without othering. And even those of us, quote unquote, on the left, we actually, I mean, I've gone to so many meetings where we say we want people of color to come together with our indigenous brothers and sisters and do X. And I say, what about white people? It's like, we say everybody. So what do we really create a politics and a story that's about everybody? We haven't done that for the most part. And the only thing I would say, and I say this to my students at Berkeley, it's like when you say capitalism, tell me what that is. You know, we have to take the Pixar example, make it available to people. I would say by and large, the average American, the average European, the average African is not fighting over capitalism versus socialism. Those are ideas that the elites use, and I think it's real. But I think you have to make it accessible to people. So what is it? If you say you don't deserve health care unless you pay for it, what are you talking about? I don't deserve health care. When you say you don't deserve Social Security, what are you talking about? When you say your kids don't have a right to go to schools, that's capitalism. Well, then I don't like capitalism. So I think really making it accessible to people, I think capitalism is in some ways too big an idea, and it's also not a single idea. It's really a complex idea, and I think it's probably broken. But I think to the average person, we need to tell a story that allows them to get in the story.
We've just got one more minute for Dave. You had a question?
Oh, just quickly, I just wanted to say that the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded today, and it speaks very specifically to what we're talking about. It was awarded for the creative and destruction in the process of economics, or also called innovation-driven economics. So to address your question, Ashka, I think it has a lot to do with economics itself is a legacy of linear thinking, and it doesn't take into account other things that are involved in capitalism or economic models. It doesn't capture it. Dwayne Farmer from the Santa Fe Institutes actually suggested that complexity science needs to be part of any ongoing economic models. So the difficulty is that we've created this linearity of margin and amortization over time periods and all of this stuff about what resources are worth. But I'm reminded of the World Economic Forum in 2018 when they were talking about taxes. And that Dutch historian was talking about taxes, and the lady from Oxfam, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, because the gentleman who is the COO, the CFO of Microsoft stood up and said, we've dealt with poverty, we've done this, the world is such a better place. And she said, don't peg my experience to your GDP, because the GDP doesn't talk about the quality of the jobs and the lived experience of the thing that gives your economic model what you're considering, play internationally. So we have broken paradigms of algorithmic mathematics. When you look at this economic model award, it's math. That's all it is. So what it tells you is how to, you know what the innovation-driven model is? It's how to keep it going. That's what it's for. So there's no end in sight, and we're trying to develop these things, but we're all in this room because we know that that's not the right way to go. We feel it somewhere else. And so we have to collectively figure out how to do it differently and better.
Well, I really appreciate those comments. This was the richness that I was hoping for. I really appreciate the questions and the input from everyone else. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone.